give you a kind of viewpoint of that movie. It was about true events that occurred with the State Department at two facilities overseas, or government facilities, and they were attacked. And this movie really resonated with me because there's a long scene, believe it or not, with the facility manager during this movie when they know that the wave of personnel are coming to attack the compound. So put yourself in that mindset that they know they just lost the embassy building. They didn't know where the ambassador was, and they were scared, and they were not prepared for this, okay? So what really resonated with me was that the SOF team, the Special Operation Forces Group, were asking the facility manager, codenamed Viper in the movie, to shut off the lights in certain parameters of the building, like keep the exterior going and the interior off. So this gentleman is running around scared, trying to figure it out, and he can't do it, right? So that's the mindset. This is Hollywood's take of a facility manager. Now I'm going to go to an actual slide of me taking a video in Ukraine during the initial unprovoked attack from Russia during the first month of the bombings. So I'll play this for you all. The almost hourly air raid sightings, as you can hear in the background. So just imagine being in that situation where I knew bombing was happening, I knew the intelligence that was going on there, and I was like, wow, this is really happening, right? And I'm gonna go through how I successfully got through that in some other situations, and now that I also support OBO and the State Department for emergency planning just for situations like this, okay? So with that being said, this was the aftermath of that video that I just took. This was at our safe house overseas, and that smoke coming up was the actual Russian missiles that hit. In not the video, I couldn't take this picture just because of security. A missile actually hit about 350 meters from our location, and it really shook the ground. And I saw some tough people, including myself, get really scared, right? It's a very humbling realization until you realize how you're going to react. That fight or flight is real. All right. All right. So some of the key objectives for this presentation is I really want you to take away what you can learn to identify operational vulnerabilities for both natural disasters and civil unrest, and how you can manage to institute lessons learned from the State Department into your facilities. And also consider contingency planning, and also the shift that we are currently doing and the realization from the department on the value of facility manager, facility executives have during crises, as well as senior planning for the C-suite, okay? The presentation, I wanted to start off on some key takeaways. If there's anything that you take away from this presentation, are these first couple slides, okay? This is a picture of my family and I with Secretary of State Blinken, where I received the Heroism Award, the only facility manager in our department to get this for what my first acts were in Ukraine. But the only reason I was successful was for these key things with the department. And the most important thing you need to know is that your family does and needs to come first, okay? And that's critical. Because when an emergency event does occur, both natural or man-made, if you don't have a plan for you and your family, you will not think clearly during an emergency. And I saw colleagues who did not do that, and it really woke up my eyes, because I practiced with my family over multiple years for different scenarios and how to plan for that. So I knew comfortably that they would be safe when something like this happens, okay? And that's critical. Number two, I always recommend, and I tell people when they ask me this, what do you do, Jim? And I keep it always, no matter where I am in the world or in the United States, a supply of emergency, medicine, food, etc., for at least 5 days. And I know a lot of people talk about the 3-day rule, but I'm a week type of guy or longer, okay? And then a couple other things that I've learned too is to have a bug out bag with all your medicine, legal documents. So if you have to move out of your house quickly within 15 minutes, you can, right? And that's critical. Also, have emergency rally points based on the emergency. For example, fire in your house, fire at your facilities. Where are those rally points, right? Does everyone know? Does your family know where to go? Okay? And then the other thing that I also learned is to keep supplies in your office. So if you're stuck in your office and you're working 24/7 during a crisis, you're going to need some downtime, and you're going to need sleep, and you're going to need to take care of yourself so that you can be strong for others. Okay? All right. The other main takeaways from planning for a crisis is people will need support, and they'll need continuing reassurance that everything's going to be okay. And I like to tell colleagues that are going through these events, it's okay not to be okay, and that's perfectly fine. All right. And then lastly, you cannot do emergency planning on the last day. This is a continuing process, day in, day out, and you should really set a time to actively recall what you would do in an emergency situation and then actually do some drilling so you do not forget, because we all forget things. There's that forget curve, right? Right. All right. So the first thing that typically happens for an emergency is accountability, okay? So with accountability, we want to know where all our staff are and also who, based on their subject matter expertise on how they can support your facilities, is critical. So what we do with the State Department, we work with HR, and we also have these systems in place where we have an ability to get a hold of personnel during any crisis, okay? And with that, have a printout of it, have actual physical locations, home addresses, phone numbers, personal emails with HR. And I also recommend, if you have a big staff, having your leadership have also contacts with them as well. And then what we typically do, practice overseas and in the United States, is we have rally points with our staff, so if an emergency does happen, we know we can all get together if we live close to one another. And that's another way to find out how everyone's doing, okay? The other big consideration is if you have an international organization and you travel overseas, I highly recommend that you set up with our U.S. State Department STEP program. And that's through our consular affairs colleagues. So if you're traveling to, say, even on vacation to Mexico or Europe or wherever, you take that dream vacation like we were discussing in the Women in FM, where would you want to go conference, and there were some pretty cool places like Bora Bora. Well, if you're flying over there, the State Department wants to know who's going there and how to get a hold of you during a crisis. And we actually help and support personnel, U.S. citizens, and that's one of our main objectives, is to protect U.S. citizens overseas and get them out in case of an emergency. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay. This is key to having sustainable operations. I truly believe in the power of influence of your staff on assessment and planning, because we don't know everything, and we need to rely on our subject matter experts in the field. And typically when I get overseas, within the first couple weeks or week, I like to sit my entire team down, give them an index card, and I ask them to write down 1 or 2 names of personnel that they think that is the most influential in the organization, in their team, and it cannot be a supervisor, okay? Because what I want to start doing is meeting with this staff, the influencers, I call them the team influencers, on getting a different perspective of what's actually going on in the organization, okay? And it's a great resource from not only emergency planning, but your operational preventative maintenance to helping you do capital improvement projects, because they live and breathe this stuff. You're not walking the equipment, we got to go to all the meetings, right? So they really help me make decisions, so when a crisis does happen, I actually know what the true vulnerabilities of the compound are. And there always will be. No building is perfect, right? And with that, I want to make sure that you know that holding these monthly meetings will also help bring up these personnel that are not managers and get your influencers to start being your champion on getting operations done correctly, okay? All right. So when people have asked me in the State Department, how do I think or what do I do when I'm planning for an emergency? And I like to do the analogy for our trade is basically I like to assess a crisis or vulnerability based on if I was going to do a construction project, right? Who can tell me where is the most influence you have on a construction project? Is it during the construction phase? Is it the commissioning, right? Where is it? It's in the beginning, right? That paperwork where it doesn't cost us anything. And that's the same thing for an emergency, right? You really need to have that mentality. And also think about the people during a major capital renovation or construction project. You're going to have some key leadership in that, right? From HR to security to your C-suite, right? The same thing goes for an emergency, all right? And you really need to consider that when you're planning, all right? All right, your first line of defense during a crisis. What is it, and how do we make sure that we're successful? Now, everyone has different business plans. So, like for example, if you're a facility exec for a school or a hospital or a data center, you got to make sure that you have continuing operations 24/7, 365. Same goes with an embassy overseas because it's our rally point in case of an emergency. All right. And some things that I really instill in the organizations is we have to have sustainable operations to ensure that they're reliable during an emergency. Because I have seen some great evacs happen in the last 2 years, unfortunately, and I've had some really, really bad and good. So, and that all goes down to how we maintain that building and the planning that went into it long term, okay? Making sure you're doing the preventative maintenance, working with your circle of influencers, your technicians, your leadership, okay? Cross-training is critical. Not everyone's going to be able to get into your facility during an emergency for whatever reason, all right? And this is also another thing that I like to do when I'm going through an operations is I actually like to label everything when I'm going through there. So one of the techniques that I do when I get to an embassy is we have typically raised ceilings, and I put a color coding system based on location of valves, for example, like green for potable water, or a sticker red for hot water, or yellow for natural gas, so I know in a case of an emergency where things are, right? And those risers. And one thing I also want you to take away from emergency planning also is decide for yourself how the emergency will actually go or how that crisis will go. And that goes into the initial phases of reflection. All right, the psychology of an assessment. When I'm doing an assessment as well, I like to take this mindset, and it is true and true every emergency that I have been in, every major crisis I've been in, every war I've been in, is the Maslow hierarchy of need, right? And where do we really influence this part of the triangle, right? It's the food, the shelter, power, right? Your family, what I was talking about first. Those critical things down below so that you can actually execute and think clearly during an emergency, right? Some lessons learned that we have found over the years, and I'm gonna break it out basically on power and HVAC. But one thing that we typically like to see for facilities overseas, and this is true to hospitals as well, because there was a lot of lessons learned during our Hurricane Katrina, and that's what prime versus standby generators. So prime generators are designed to run 365 without any shutdowns, right? So if you have a standby generator, they're not designed to run all the time, and you need to know that, right? So if you're running a facility and your generator is not designed to run for a continuous time frame for a couple months, you need to know that and how to mitigate that risk, right? The other critical thing is assume that you're not going to be able to get fuel into country, okay, or your location, all right? It takes a long time, believe it or not, to have fuel go down. I know during 9/11, this made open source information that all our piping systems that distribute fuel throughout the country went down, right? And there was only jet fuel, and we couldn't get gasoline into certain parts of the country, or diesel, right? So with that being said, you need to make sure you know the levels of your fuel, when's the last time you polished it, when's the last time you overhauled those generators, if you have them in your facility, and how long can you maintain your power, and if you need to do certain strategies like load shedding to extend that fuel consumption, okay? Am I going too fast? Anybody have any questions? Oh. There will be questions. Time for questions at the end of the presentation, by the way, too. Okay, fire and HVAC. One of the things that we have learned when we're shutting down a facility is we like to actually shut the system down and see what happens, okay? And what I mean by that is, we need to trust but verify our mechanical engineering colleagues that they did take into consideration the expansion and contraction of your piping systems, right? So if you lose power, you lose your HVAC systems, and it shuts down and it cools, what happens, right? The piping contracts, and we typically get leaks. So I actually like to turn the system off, right? And I did this in Ukraine prior, because I knew I was going to have to shut the systems down, and I was afraid of a pipe burst. Okay, and luckily we didn't have one. But when I was doing the drills, we found almost 25 leaks in the system from expansion and contraction, and that was critical to know. That was very important. All right. Another key point that I want you to know is your building pressurization. Right. You always want to make sure you know if your building's in a negative pressure to the outside or a positive pressure. Right. So the reason I'm bringing this up is, if there is a natural disaster, or if your facility's actually close to a highway, or you're close to a chemical plant, for example, or you're near the docks and they have a disaster there, right? And those chemicals or whatever system that could harm you comes towards your building, you need to know what to do in that emergency. And if you shut off the HVAC system and it's in a positive pressure, what happens? Everything sucks into the building, right? But also, you need to know what kind of filters you have, right? Are they pleated? Are they HEPA, right? Because you don't want to run the system under certain scenarios, because if there is a major chemical spill or whatever, some of those filters are not designed to get that system out, and you're actually going to spread it through the building. So those are some key things that you should take into consideration for your facilities, all right? And typically in the State Department, in our embassies, we have a pretty good fire system, and we have a fire pump, we have storage tanks, et cetera. And it differs from facility to facility, and I'm sure your private sector, when I was as well, also did not have fire pumps and stuff like that, or emergency generators in some instances. But this is some things that I think about, just to reiterate, okay? And I do test them weekly. We do look at those pretty regularly to ensure that we're meeting standards, okay? All right, when you're looking at your facility, one of the things I recommend is that you do a general assessment of the location and how long it would take to evac or get into your building, all right? So I did Washington, D.C. from Main State. This is just me putting a diagram together to determine how long it would take travel time depending on rush hour, right? Not peak hours. How are the staff going to evac from our Main State? Can they use the public transportation? Will they have to walk, right? And this is what we came up with, or I came up with for an evacuation base for subways, okay? The other important thing I would like you to know is, look at your alternative routes to and from your office and understand what those choke points are. And what I mean by choke points is if you have to pass the same light or street to get to your facilities, that's a choke point, and that's a vulnerability. That's a risk, right? So if you are in a facilities that has thousands of employees and you're a soft target for, say, an active shooter, or have historical value, that may be a risk, right? So you need to know how to evac, and the bad guys are going to be typically at those locations figuring out what's going to happen, and that's where they look. So know your choke points and alternative means. Okay? All right, contingency planning. So we've talked about the vulnerabilities, right, and some basic lessons learned that we've had from state where you all can take it and hopefully institute some of these best practices into your organization. And some key things that we do to be successful in these emergencies is develop an emergency planning. And typically what happens in an embassy is we have what's called a command center, where we all get together and we sit down, and that's where we have all our communications, we have our top leadership, and we have certain personnel designating and determining what's going to happen to the facilities or how we're going to react to whatever the event is, okay? The thing that I learned in Kiev during that crisis was one critical thing that I made a mistake on, and that's that I did not actually set up an office or a conference room for an emergency facility management staging point. And what I would recommend that you have in that is your drawings, copy of your O&M manuals, right? And really have a good understanding of the layout of your facilities, because that's what people are going to be looking at that have never walked into your facilities, right? They're not going to know it like you will. They're going to want to know where the hydrants are. They're going to want to know, do you have natural gas, right? All those things that are a risk for a facility. And this is also really important. So, we do a lot of planning, but what I also like to do is I like to print out startup and shutdown procedures for major assets at our different locations, right? And what I like to do is I ask my staff, who's the subject matter expert, to put it in an explanation, simple form that a 5-year-old can understand, right? That is so important, because if they can't get to the facility and you need to shut down power or water or HVAC because you have a major leak, what are you going to do? You can't just rely on one person, right? Okay. This is a picture of me and the military in Ukraine. This young man was a real inspiration to me, and we were somewhere in country, and this was during the initial attacks, and we were going over planning, like what to do, right, if something happened. And that's important, okay? Working with your first responders and how they will react. If your organization allows, I would recommend that you actually get those people into your facility. Invite them out to coffee, okay? Have them look at the vulnerabilities and risks for you. What are those risks? Because they'll have a different set of eyes, okay? know where the hydrants are, know where we evac, okay? And train and practice, drill with them. I typically like to make sure at every facilities I have the fire trucks, the ambulances, the hazmat groups actually come through the embassy to see if one will fit through our gates, right? We want to know if they can actually get to our compound and through our compound. And one of the things we have to worry about is for the fire department overseas, there's different types of connections to a hydrant. So I always have to make sure we have the correct connections to hook up those hoses. In the United States, thank God you don't have to worry about it, but it's one of the interesting things that we take a look at when we're stationed overseas. Okay. Okay. Internal crisis planning and training. I feel that I was successful, and it's our role in the State Department to ensure that we make sure our security folks, who are called diplomatic security, who are a wonderful set of guys and gals to help us keep the buildings protected and going through this. This picture I took somewhere in country, and this just, I don't know if you can see the shell numbers, but these are all 0. So when we were driving around during the war, initial phases, the country couldn't get fuel. And there was lines. Right? And we're traveling around and we're trying to figure out how we're going to get to the next rally point, okay? And how are we going to get there safely? So we knew through our counterparts and contacts that fuel was a major issue. So what did we do before we were driving in from Poland? We stocked up on fuel, right? And a lot of it, and food, water, just like that initial planning I was talking about. And we were able to get to certain locations, and I had to use that fuel. In those trucks that I was keeping in there, all right? So it was an eye-opener for me. And it will take a lot longer than you think to get normalized during a crisis like this, okay? But going back to diplomatic security, asking those probing questions with DS to help them and back them up is really important. I really believe that we are a people's business and that our reputation will help us succeed in this industry, right? To add that value. And I could not have been successful without these amazing colleagues and mentors, really. The other thing I also recommend is you put a suggestion box a couple times a year on vulnerabilities of your facilities. It's a free, basically, consultation of what's going on in your facilities from a different set of eyes. And we have found some amazing risk based on my political colleagues, the ambassador, the deputy chief of mission. They have brought some very valid points that I didn't think about, right? The more eyes we look at this, the better off we'll be. So I do recommend that you have an anonymous system where on occasion, not all the time because it'll get fatigued, but a couple times a year, maybe during fire month, right, you do fire, hey, what's fire risk? Do you see any issues, right? Is there any detectors that are blinking, right? And you'll be surprised on that. And then the other thing that we do very well for drilling, and this is critical to your success, is having the ability to communicate in an open environment where you're not afraid of judgment and being inclusive. And so what I mean by that is if you make a mistake or one of your staff makes a mistake, it is so important to thank them for that, right? I have had some really tough U.S. Marines that I have worked with that, chew nails for a living and spit them out like bullets. Be humble and really show, I need to work on this, right? And that was humbling for me when I first got into the State Department. It was really amazing to see that side of someone that you never expected. And it made me realize that drills are important and it does help us plan for contingencies. And I cannot tell you, if we did not plan the way we did for Ukraine and other places overseas that we have evacuated for like Khartoum, we'd have been in big trouble, right? Okay. Lessons learned. So one of the things that I did is I did a pool of my colleagues that have been in similar crises as I. And I really got these are the main takeaways that they told me to tell you all. And I thought this was pretty powerful. This picture right here made the national news, and this is the flag raising of Ukraine. So I was the last group of people to leave Ukraine, Kiev, and the first person back. And it was just me and security. Okay, it wasn't the ambassador, it wasn't the deputy chief of mission. Okay, and that was a huge paradigm shift for the department, because they were like, oh, we need to get in there and talk political. No, we need to get our facilities faced safely so they can do their business, right? And that's one of our key roles as OBO, is to make sure that our diplomatic policy colleagues can actually be in a safe environment so that they can think clearly and communicate to Washington so we can make better decisions. So I'm right up there standing there, and I have some amazing folks. This is all our security colleagues, and one of them is the defense attaché for the Air Force, and she was a wonderful person. But some key takeaways, and I do want to read this slide because I think it's important as well. There will always be distractions and other priorities for emergency planning and during a crisis, right? So keep that in mind, and that's so true. Make a plan everyone knows and can execute, okay? This is a really great piece of advice. This is from my colleague who was in Afghanistan. Question all assumptions, right? Because if you don't have a good baseline of what your facilities is doing or what's going to happen during an emergency, you're not planning correctly, right? So do question that assumptions, including senior staff, the C-suite. I have actually done that in a diplomatic way, okay? You can't do it on the last day. I cannot stress that enough. That's something that I like to institute in my planning, and it's an ongoing process, right? So if we don't have reliable facilities, we don't have a good preventative maintenance, a predictive plan, or an understanding of what our risk, we're in trouble, right? Request support, but be prepared to tackle issues yourself. So when I was in the Ukraine and in supporting the evacuation in Khartoum, that was so true. We had trouble getting a hold of personnel. We did not know how we were going to handle certain situations. And I actually, when I was in Kiev during the initial phases of this, we had power outages all the time. Okay, so what happened, it really, there was arcing and flashing through the municipality, and we would get that resulting hitting our systems, right? So our generators would kick on, and then it would mess up our ATSs, okay? And I also forgot to tell you all about this story. One of the things that, going back to drilling, when we knew something was going to happen real quick, what I did is I simulated an emergency for my staff a couple weeks before the initial attack. And what I did was I shut off the power to the entire embassy. And the only people that knew about it was me, the front office, and diplomatic security. And I wanted to see what my staff would do, who could come in, and who we could get a hold of, all right? That takeaway probably saved lives, because during that testing, we couldn't get the generators back on. And it was a big problem. We thought everything was planned. I had spare parts. We had the sequences laminated, put it all over the utility plant. I thought we were golden. We knew the fuel usages. We did the maintenance on the generators, but we couldn't get the generators up and running. What happened? A simple $250 battery on our ATS was the reason we couldn't get it on, right? And it knocked out our PLC controller, right? So I was shocked, right? And I'll never forget our electrical engineering being like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know, this doesn't make sense, right? But this is so important for drills and actually testing your systems, okay? Sorry about that. And the other thing the last takeaway is we are a people's business, right? We need to ensure that we have the right people advising us to make good decisions. Having that network is critical to your success, okay? And that goes back to your influencers and your team, okay? And with that, I'll go with questions, but before I go to questions, if anybody wants some additional information or interested about the State Department and what we do, it's a really great program. If you're looking for a career change or know people that are looking for a career change in the facility management, it's been the best decision I've ever done in my entire life for me and my family. I have been able to do some amazing things overseas and be a part of a great organization that has a great mission, right? You're protecting Americans overseas, you're serving your country, right? And you're a diplomat, right? So you represent the United States, and it's an honor and a privilege to be in this position. And if you want more information, you can scan that barcode, and I'll leave that up longer so that you can, if you know anybody, and we can link you up to applying to the State Department as a Foreign Service Facility Manager. All right? I'll start with questions. Anybody have any questions? I know it's early in the morning, it's the last week.
I think we all have heard a lot of this stuff before, and I think it's really good to hear it again and get your perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Where do you work?
A school district.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, so active shooters, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Locking down the facility.
Points in there.
Yeah. Any other questions, concerns, comments? It's a combination of everything. So what we typically do, so for example, there's a crisis going on in Haiti. So all through this week, I've been advising with our military DoD colleagues as well as other agencies like USAID to our diplomatic security colleagues. And basically what we do is we sit down in a room and we start planning and discussing our vulnerabilities and what we need to do in a situation like this. And the really cool thing about that is it doesn't matter what your title is at this point, because we all bring value to the organization at some point, and we collaborate to make this good decisions. And I know we get a lot of bad press on certain emergencies. I mean it's true, right? But we would be in a lot worse shape if we did not have these drills and that open communication factors on it. So it is a gambit of things. Now, one of the critical roles as diplomats overseas is we have to work with a host nation. We're there as their guests, right? So, and they're going through this crisis. So sometimes we're figuring out what are their capabilities, can we support them, right? And that really goes to our top leadership, our ambassador, DCM, our political econ colleagues that go and talk to these people, right? And figure out what they're going through and understand, right? Okay. Any other things?
Question, during normal travel, and you're leaving the country, you do a lot of traveling, should you let the embassy know that you're in different countries? Because we've never done that.
Yes, and that's that STEP program. That is so critical. So, for example, I'm one of the leaders that's planning what's going on in Haiti and how we're going to react to that if something bad happens, okay? The first question the administration asks me or in our departments is how many Americans are in country, right? And the way that we do that is partially through the STEP program. And to be perfectly honest, that STEP program has saved a lot of American lives because we have been able to get people out of country and set up rally points for evacs, right? It also helps you plan as well because what we do is we tell people, hey, something bad's going to happen, right? There's a no double standard law that was passed, I don't know when, where whatever information the U.S. Embassy knows, we have to legally let you all know as a public. That's that No Double Standard Act. So if we're sending out messages through the STEP program, be it like you need to leave the country or be prepared for this, we're saying it for a reason, and it's really important. All right. And if you do travel internationally, I can give you some other tips too for your things. For example, the networks typically overseas, depending on the region, communication and fuel is the first thing to fail, okay? And what we typically recommend is it's a very expensive process, but certain personnel have a sat phone so that you can call in, okay? But do know your numbers to the American Embassy, and do know how to get there in an emergency if your staff is stationed overseas, okay? Because that's our role, and a very critical role in my opinion. Any other thing?
Do you start with like stay criteria to go criteria?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Do you start with like stay, like shelter in place type of criteria and then go criteria?
It's, honestly, it's
Lots of little decisions.
yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into those decisions. So for example, Khartoum, right? When we evacuated that embassy during the coup, and there was a lot of Americans stuck there. All right, we were trying to figure out how we were going to get them out by plane, convoy. We didn't know at first, right? We were trying to figure that out. Because of the instability of that country, we recommended Americans shelter in place initially because we wanted to make sure no one got hurt or killed initially during the initial attacks in the city. And they were taking over major points like road access, the choke point to the airport, right? Or the fuel stations, okay? Yeah. All right. All right, we're in booth 1136 if you have any additional questions. It's an absolute honor and privilege to talk to you all, and I really appreciate your time and efforts, and thank you for your time.